Let me begin today's session with a slightly uncomfortable observation. Most UPSC aspirants believe that reading comprehension becomes difficult because the passages themselves are complicated. Students often feel that the vocabulary is difficult, the arguments are abstract, or the passages are too long to process quickly in the exam hall. But if we carefully analyze CSAT papers from the last decade, something very interesting becomes visible. The passages themselves are rarely the real problem. If you examine them closely, you will notice that most passages are written in reasonably clear language. The vocabulary is generally manageable. The arguments are structured. And the passages themselves are rarely longer than one page. Yet every year, thousands of serious aspirants lose marks in reading comprehension. So, the natural question arises, if the passages are not extremely difficult, then why do so many aspirants struggle with reading comprehension? This question has to be arise in students. The answer lies somewhere else. UPSC does not defeat students through the passage. Then why? Then UPSC defeats students through the answer options. The real battlefield of reading comprehension is not the passage. The real battlefield is option interpretation. Over the last several years, I analyzed CSAT reading comprehension papers from 2013 to 2025, and a very clear pattern emerges. UPSC repeatedly uses a limited set of structures, trap structures, while designing incorrect answer options. Once students learn to recognize these traps, eliminate wrong answers become far easier. From 2013 to 2016, they asked direct options. Options relatively directly they are asked. From 17 to 19, scope traps increased, and 2020 to 2025, what happened? Sophisticated trap architecture has been evolved. So, why UPSC uses trap options? This is exactly what we will decode in today's session. Before we examine these traps, we must understand why UPSC designs questions this way. UPSC is not merely testing English comprehension and vocabulary. UPSC is testing disciplined interpretation under uncertainty. Think about real administrative life. In administrative work, officers constantly read policy reports, committee recommendations, economic analysis, and competing arguments. Often the difficulty is not understanding the text itself. The real challenge is deciding which interpretation is reasonable and which interpretation is misleading. So, two people may read the same paragraph, but one interpretation may remain faithful to the other's reasoning, and the other interpretation may distort it slightly. Reading comprehension in CSAT exam simulates exactly like these skills. The passage gives you information, but the answer options Test whether you can interpret that information carefully and accurately. That is why UPSC deliberately designs answer options that appear plausible but contain subtle distortions. That is why UPSC deliberately designs answer options that appear plausible but contain subtle distortions. So you have to understand the logic from not only passages, you have to examine the options is very much need of the hour. As far as 2022-2025 CSAT papers analysis is saying this only. That is why UPSC deliberately designs answer options that appear plausible but contain subtle distortions. So in reading comprehension, your task is not simply reading. Your task is detecting misleading interpretations. Before we examine individual traps, remember something important. UPSC rarely creates completely random incorrect options. Most strong answers belong to recognizable patterns. Once you learn to recognize these patterns, elimination becomes much faster and more reliable. That is why you have to recognize these patterns. If you recognize these patterns, then elimination will be easier and much faster and more reliable. Instead of feeling confused between multiple options, you begin to notice signals that indicate a trap. Let us now examine the most common trap architectures used in UPSC reading comprehension. That is first and foremost trap 1, extreme word trap. One of the most common traps in UPSC reading comprehension is the extreme word trap. What what is the common trap UPSC using? Extreme word trap. These traps usually appear through certain words such as only, always, completely, never, entirely, inevitable. These words create absolute claims. But if you carefully observe UPSC passages, you will notice something interesting. Most passages maintain balanced reasoning. Others usually acknowledge complexity. They often discuss multiple perspectives. They rarely make extreme claims. So, when a balanced passage suddenly produces an extreme conclusion in the option, that option becomes suspicious. However, remember an important rule, that is, extreme words do not automatically make an option incorrect. Please remember this sentence carefully. Extreme words do not automatically make an option incorrect. They are warning signals. Whenever you see such words, pause and verify the passage carefully. Ask yourself, did the author actually make such an absolute claim? Very often you will realize that the author used more cautious language. And that is when the extreme wording becomes a trap. So, as far as extreme word trap is concerned, you have to identify the words. When you identify the words in the passage, you have to cautious and passage read more carefully. even option also. That is the most important thing for this trap architecture. To solve, to crack the passage correctly. Then we are moving to trap number 2, that is scope expansion trap. The second trap is scope expansion. This happens when the option expands the argument beyond what the passage actually states. This happens when the option expands the argument beyond what the passage actually states. This is most important point. The passage may discuss a limited idea, but the option turns that idea into a broader generalization. For example, the passage may analyze a particular policy issue, but the option suddenly explains all governance failures using that single factor. The option becomes more ambitious than the passage itself. Whenever an option becomes broader than the argument in the passage, please be cautious. UPSC often uses scope expansion to create attractive but incorrect answers. UPSC often uses scope expansion trap to create attractive the option but incorrect answers. So the trap number 3 is scope reduction trap. Sometimes UPSC does the opposite. Instead of expanding the argument, the option reduces the meaning of the passage. The passage may analyze a complex structural issue, but the option simplifies it into a narrow interpretation. This is exactly opposite to the trap number 2, that is scope expansion trap. For example, a passage may explain a broad economic leadership, but the option reduces it to a specific policy recommendations. The richness of the argument disappears. This is known as scope reduction. This is known as scope reduction. Here the option is not technically wrong in language, but it oversimplifies the other's reasoning. That is the scope reduction trap. This is exactly opposite to scope expansion trap. Then we will moving ahead to trap number 4, that is policy prescription trap. Another common trap occurs when the passage is analytical but the option introduces a strong policy recommendation. When the passage is analytical but the option introduces a strong policy recommendation, UPSC passages usually analyze the problems. They rarely prescribe extreme policy solutions, but some options suddenly introduce statements such as government must completely ban something or policymakers must immediately implement a drastic measure. When you see such strong policy prescriptions, please be cautious because often the author only analyzed a problem. The option is inserting a policy conclusion the author never made in that particular passage. That is why you have to careful while reading the passage and while reading the options also. Trap number 5, unsupported assumption trap. Another trap appears frequently in assumption questions. The option introduces an idea that sounds reasonable in real life, but it is not required by the passage. This idea may feel logical, it may even appear correct in general discussion, but if the passage does not depend on that assumption, the option becomes incorrect. Please remember this point carefully. In reading comprehension, answers must come from the passage, not from general discussion, not from outside knowledge. This is the most important fundamental thing for reading comprehension as far as UPSC CSAT is concerned. Then trap number 6, logical distortion trap. What is logical distortion trap? Logical distortion trap is one of the more subtle traps. In this trap, the option uses words from the passage. The vocabulary looks familiar, but the logical relationship between ideas is slightly altered. For example, a cause and effect relationship may be reversed, or the conclusion may be slightly modified. Because the language looks familiar, many students miss the distortion. That is why careful interpretation is essential for the solving passages reading comprehension as far as UPSC CSAT is concerned. Then trap number 7 and final trap, partial truth trap. Now we come to the most dangerous trap in UPSC reading comprehension. The partial truth trap is here the option begins with something that is actually correct. The first part of the sentence matches passages. Students recognize this familiar idea. They feel confident. But the second half of the option quietly introduces a misleading inference. Because the first half sounded correct, many students stop checking carefully. Then problem comes here, from here. And that is exactly where UPSC inserts the distortion. Remember this rule carefully. UPSC smartest wrong answers are not false from the beginning. They become false gradually. This is the classical idea from UPSC to mislead the students, to option wrongly committed. So you may have some doubts like why students fall into reading comprehension traps. Let me be very clear. Students usually fall into reading comprehension traps for three reasons. First, they read options quickly and recognize only familiar keywords. They read options quickly and recognize only familiar keywords. And second one is they apply outside knowledge instead of relying strictly on the passage. This is most common mistake students have committed. Third, they choose the option that sounds reasonable in real life. This is also most important thing. UPSC knows this. That is why incorrect options are designed to look attractive for students to trap. Now, let us discuss another important concept, that is passage families. Reading comprehension passages usually follow recognizable reasoning structures. These are called passage families. Examples: argument passages, concept explanation passages, problem or conflict passages, cause and effect passages, policy analysis passages, comparative passages, philosophical passages, and behavioral passages. These passages, reading comprehension usually follow recognizable these reasoning structures. This passage family class we explained previous class. Reasoning the passage family helps students understand how the argument is structured. Explain this passage in previous class, very much elaborated. Please go through that class and understand what is passages, what is passage families, etc. From analyzing CSAT papers from 2013 to 2025, we notice a clear pattern, that is 80-20 rule of reasoning comprehension. Most passages belong to three families: concept explanation, argument, problem, or conflict. Most reasoning comprehension passages belongs to these three families only. If students becomes more comfortable with these three families, they can control most reasoning reading comprehension passages. Let us apply this framework briefly. Consider the ecosystem passage from the recent CSAT paper from 2025. The passage discusses biodiversity conservation, livelihood dependence, and commercial use of ecosystems. Clearly, this is a problem conflict passage. The author is not supporting an extreme position. Instead, the author highlights a structural tension between conservation, livelihoods, and economic use. When we examine the options, we see several traps. Some exaggerated the argument, some purpose extreme policy solutions, some introduces not mentioned in the passages. Once we recognize these traps, elimination becomes much more easier. Now let me share a simple elimination method, that is Metis elimination algorithm. Whenever you evaluate an option, ask three questions to yourselves. First one, does this option match the passage? Then second one, does this option follow the other's reasoning? And third one and final one, that is, does the option introduce exaggeration or distortion? Match the passage, others' reasoning, and exaggeration or distortion. these three. If an option fails any of these tests, you have to eliminate it without second thought. Now here is a powerful insight for you. The two option reality. Most UPSC reading comprehension questions eventually become two option decisions. Means what? Two options are usually clearly wrong. After eliminating them, two options remain in four options. Both may appear reasonable. At that point, the correct answer is the option closest to others' reasoning. Closest to others' reasoning. So remember carefully, reading comprehension is not about instantly finding the correct answer. It is about eliminating incorrect answers. It is eliminating incorrect answers. An important thing is we are describing and demonstrating five powerful reading comprehension examples from CSAT 2024 and 2025 that clearly demonstrate the traps you explained. Sorry, I explained till now. That is trap demonstrations using previous year's questions from CSAT 2024 to 2025. I'm using these two papers for explaining traps. Example 1, problem conflict passage. As far as CSAT 2025 papers is concerned, this passage appeared ecosystem, livelihood versus conservation. The idea of the passage is maintaining ecosystems for biodiversity may reduce commercial exploitation and affect livelihoods dependent on the ecosystem. Then, what is the passage family? Problem or conflict. Then, structure, conservation versus livelihood dependence versus commercial exploitation. This is the passage structure. Then comes to the point, very important, that is trap example. Incorrect option. Commercial exploitation of ecosystem must be completely stopped. Completely. You have to understand and you have to identify the trap word. That is extreme word trap. And policy description also. Sometimes both traps in one option. Why it is wrong? The passage discusses conflict between different interests. It does not support a total ban. So UPSC exaggerates the argument into an extreme policy position. That is why when a passage describes tensions between interests, UPSC rarely supports absolute solutions. Please mind it. And next one, example number 2, that is concept explanation passage, which is also taken from CSAT 2025 paper, that is renewable energy learning curve. What is the idea? The main idea is the development of renewable energy technologies follows a learning curve where costs fall as adoption increases. This is the idea of the passage. What is the passage family? You have to identify first. That is concept explanation. Then what is the structure of the passage family? That is concept explanation. First one, concept, it leads to evidence and it leads to implication. This is the structure of the concept explanation passage. Then we have to identify the trap example in the option sector. Incorrect option. Renewable energy transition will inevitably eliminate fossil fuel usage. Inevitably eliminate. Extreme water trap. Why incorrect? The passage explains cost reduction dynamics. It does not claim inevitable elimination of fossil fuels. The option exaggerates the concept. Concept passage explain mechanisms, not guaranteed outcomes. Example number 3, comparative passage, which we taken from CSAT 2024, that is urban planning education. What is the idea? What is the idea of this passage? Western urban planning education differs from planning systems in India. This is the idea of the passage. How to identify the passage family, that is comparative passage. When you have to approach systems comparison, then will it come under comparative passage. What is the structure? Western planning versus Indian planning approach the education system. They are comparative. They are comparing. You have to trap identify the trap example. Incorrect option. That is urban governance failures in India are caused by poor planning education. This is scope expansion trap. Urban governance failures in India are caused by poor planning education. By the poor planning education, it impacts urban governance failures. In this option, mentioned it like this. This is scope expansion trap. We have to check why incorrect, why it is incorrect. A passage compares educational approaches. It does not explain all governance failures. The option expands the argument far beyond the passage. That is why when UPSC compares the systems, options often overgeneralize the comparison. When UPSC compares systems, options often overgeneralize the comparison. Then behavioral passage. Again taken from CSAT 2024, that is travel and cultural understanding. What is the idea of the passage? Travel exposes individuals to diverse cultures and expands understanding of universal human values. What is the passage family belongs to this passage? Behavioral and social science. What is the structure of that passage family? Human experience, it leads to behavioral insight, and it leads to cultural understanding. This is the structure of the passage family. Then we have to identify the trap. What is the incorrect option? Travel guarantees cultural tolerance. This is extreme word trap. Guarantees. Why it is incorrect? The passage suggests is greater understanding, not guaranteed outcomes. The option converts probability into certainty. That is why this option is incorrect. Behavioral passages usually describe tendencies, not giving guarantees. And this is final example, that is cause and effect passage, which we have taken from CSAT 2025 food consumption and animal protein passage. What is the idea of this passage? As societies grow wealthier, grain consumption shifts toward feeding livestock, leading to inefficient calorie conversion. We have to focus on the idea of the passage itself. That is most important thing. The first instances you have to do. As societies grow wealthier, grain consumption shifts toward feeding livestock, leading to inefficient calorie conversion. We have to identify the passage family first instance. That is cause and effect. So what is the structure of passage family? Wealth increase, higher meat consumption. It leads to inefficient grains usage. This is the structure of the passage. What is the trap example? What is the incorrect option? Governments must promote cereal based diets. Governments must promote cereal based diets. Scope reduction plus policy trap. This is why incorrect, why it is incorrect option. The passage explains an economic relationship. It does not recommended policy intervention. That is why this option is incorrect. Cause and effect passages explain mechanisms, not policy solutions. You can end the demonstration. UPSC does not design difficult passages. UPSC designs intelligent traps in the options. Once you recognize those traps, reading comprehension becomes a process of controlled elimination. When we comes to exam hall strategy, what is the exam hall strategy? In the exam hall, follow a simple sequence. First, identify the passage family. Then, second, understand the author's direction. Third, evaluate the options carefully. And fourth one, eliminate trap options. You have to remember this structure. First one, identify the passage family, understand the author's direction, evaluate the options carefully, and eliminate trap options. This is the structure. Structures prevents panic. Let me conclude today's session with one important insight. Most students believe reading comprehension becomes difficult because the passages are complicated. But after analyzing CSAT papers from 2013 to 2025, we see a very different reality. That is, the passages themselves are rarely the real problem. The passages themselves are rarely the real problem. The real difficulty lies in interpreting the answer options. UPSC deliberately designs options that contain subtle distortions like extreme wording, scope expansion, scope reduction, policy prescription, unsupported assumption, logical distortion, and partial truths. These are the trap architecture. These are the trap architecture. Types of traps UPSC used. Once students learn to recognize these patterns, reading comprehension becomes much easier to control. That is why you have to identify and understand the structure of the patterns of traps, passage families, etc. UPSC does not test how fast you read. UPSC tests how carefully you interpret. Reading comprehension is not about reading faster. It is about thinking more carefully. Thank you. In UPSC reading comprehension, the passage rarely defeats students. Students defeat themselves by choosing interpretations the author never made.